Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. My name is Penny Colpin, and continuing on with our series, today I'll be talking about analogies and metaphors that deal with more of an eruptive or explosive type of experience. Before doing so, I'm remembering to say I am not a medical doctor. I'm not providing medical advice. I'm just trying to provide material that either did or would have helped me through a very difficult mental crisis, what I've always called a severe stress breakdown, but what many people get labeled with things like bipolar, psychosis, even schizophrenia, which I was never diagnosed with schizophrenia, but I recognize that in terms of ego collapse or shadow explosion, if the contents involved is much more traumatizing, it could be that there's a similar process, but then I was lucky because I did not have a background of severe physical or abusive trauma stored in my system. So anyway, yeah, this is about the eruptive and explosive types analogies that some of them I've thought of for a long time, and some of them are relatively new. One of the first ones, basically anything that you can stuff that then gives way. An example I use is just that of a balloon. You could take a simple balloon and you keep putting more and more air into it, more and more air into it, and not let any of that air go anywhere. At some point, that thing's going to pop. I equate that to the idea of me shoving stuff off into the shadow. And in fact, even in the first couple weeks after the severe breakdown I had in 1998, I thought I was letting stuff roll off my back, but I realized that I'd been shoving it into a glass ball and continued to shove and continued to shove. And in my case, a moral injury came along and whacked that glass ball hard enough that things erupted. That's one way I describe it. But getting back to the balloon, so it may not be air that gets shoved into that balloon. What if it's like chocolate pudding or something, or motor oil? That when that thing explodes, it makes a major mess. I mean, stuff goes everywhere. It's difficult to clean up. That also could be part of the analogy or metaphor. One of the obvious ones involves volcanic eruption. So I've flown through Iceland a couple times. A couple years ago, the geologists noted um, that they were able to predict that volcanic activity would happen out in the southwest part of Iceland, not too far from the capital, Reykjavik. And what I found interesting, I actually watched some of it. It was kind of interesting, is that often when we think of volcanic eruption, we think of a conic volcano, Etna, spewing major debris, however mile or two into the air. But the volcanoes or the volcanic activity in Iceland was basically along a straight line, a fissure, and it was almost like a fountain of lava just spewing up, I don't know, 70, 80 feet in the air. I don't remember how high, but it basically made a long line. Now, because they expected this to happen, as part of the preparation, the Icelanders put berms in place in an effort to protect the town of, I think it was Grindavik was the name of it. And so they showed drone footage of how here's this berm, and on the one side, there's this fissure of this volcanic activity. And then lo and behold, here comes a little spout of lava on the other side of the berm. So it goes to, there is unpredictability. In the case of Iceland, they had symptoms. Well, I had symptoms of major breakdown for 2 years before this happened. And I know this whole breakdown could have been avoided had my burnout been treated. But even then, there were a few homes lost in that town from that activity. But just that eruption part of it could vary quite a bit. Different heights, different volume, that type of thing. But people will talk about eruption of the subconscious. Another one I use is that of basically, like I say, any kind of explosion, any kind of thing where you use dynamite to blow something up. Although usually when you're using dynamite, it's a planned explosion, which is quite a bit different. But there was a case in Bozeman in March of 2009 where a building downtown, there was a gas leak. And when a young woman went into work that day, she turned on the light, and just that small little spark caused the building to blow up. It actually took out a few businesses downtown. And of course, then there was the tragedy of her being caught up in that. But then what I found interesting was that for a couple days afterwards, the firefighters and the professionals, they kept the fire burning for a couple days until they could figure out where the gas leak. And they were concerned that if they put the fire out, that the gas would just, be trapped or collect somewhere else and cause a potential other type of dangerous situation. And of course, it was something that took months, I think almost a year or more before those buildings were replaced. So even in a case like that, just the process of dealing with the aftermath may take quite some time to rebuild and regenerate that which blew. Since I live about an hour and a half north of Yellowstone National Park, I would be remiss in not using the analogy of geysers to compare with this type of eruptive experience of the subconscious. Old Faithful, of course, you may not know, but she's been erupting regularly for centuries, about every 90 minutes. But in July of 2024, it was actually mid-morning, about 10 a.m., a place called Biscuit Basin. There were a number of people on the boardwalks in that area, and all of a sudden, boom, this thing exploded for, I don't remember how many seconds, but looking at the aftermath and the pictures, and there's actually people who had been, they had their cell phones, were recording. I'll see if I can find some of the ones that I'm thinking of and put it in the notes. But looking at the aftermath of that there was, clogged debris from this geyser basin area, that as it erupted, it spewed stuff all over, covering boardwalks. People were running amidst, it wasn't just hot water involved. It was different pieces of, I don't know, tree, mud, dirt, clods, that type of thing. And I remember, and I tried to find it before I started recording, there was a picture from, say, a drone view looking down on this Biscuit Basin area. And it actually showed that the blast pattern wasn't in the direction of the boardwalk, that most of the debris actually went in the other direction, even though the boardwalk was covered with debris. And so it goes to the idea of, one, people there were lucky. It could have been a lot worse. But when something erupts unexpectedly like that, and I'm talking now about more of the subconscious, how can, I won't say it can be controlled. I don't think it can be controlled, but can it be influenced to move in certain directions? Not unlike the idea of the berms in Iceland to manage lava flow as part of the aftermath. So when I did look up some of these articles, one of the titles was "Clogged Up Underground System Caused Yellowstone's Powerful Hydrothermal Explosion." So this clogged up underground system, well, that's probably the subconscious or the shadow, the unconscious, right? That it's jugged up somehow, and that pressure eventually releases somehow. So to me, that Biscuit Basin analogy is not a bad one. With regard to that, as part of what I was preparing for, I'd read a book by John Weir Perry, who was an American psychiatrist. I believe he died in the late 1990s. But he has a number of books that I've read one of them, and just even the titles of a couple of them are of interest to me. He focused on what would be called back in, especially in the 70s, which is when some of these books came out, were schizophrenic breaks, especially in young adults. And when I first read his book, The Far Side of Madness, I forgot it for a moment there. The Far Side of Madness, which even there, the title is just kind of interesting, is like, what's on the other side of this? Right on the first page, on in the introduction, he wrote, let me see if I can find it here. I can only conclude that when the depths of the psyche erupt into the open, everyone concerned becomes strange. And he doesn't mean just the person involved. He means everyone around that and people involved with it. Most of all, I find myself deeply impressed with the magnitude of the difficulties one is up against in a schizophrenic break. When the forces and contents of one's unconscious are thus unleashed and the world around seems suddenly galvanized into a stony resolve to suppress them. Even those with the kindest possible will to, quote, help, unquote, rarely understand what comes from the depths. For even after 7 decades of depth psychology, we will remain largely in the dark in this regard. That was from a book that was published in 1974. So when he mentioned 7 decades, we're now 12 decades. And this is one of the frustrations, is that even when I first read that a few years ago, just the verbiage used, which could be a metaphor of eruption. It didn't make it as much of an analogy, but this idea of the eruption from the subconscious struck me. And I thought, wow, he gets it. And so when I come across I notice the different language that people use. And you can kind of tell who has a respect for this kind of process. Some of his other titles are Trials of a Visionary Mind, which kind of ties in with that. He doesn't necessarily use the term mystic, but this something going on type thing. And I haven't read it yet. I've looked into it. Is The Self in Psychotic Process is another of his books. The self ties back to Carl Jung, which kind of goes to that core essence. Some might call it soul or something like soul. It's that core essence. And how I think of it is that we have this core essence called the self of who we truly are. And then we end up building this ego structure around it. And in this process, especially if that ego structure isn't healthy and isn't in, I guess I'd say in sync. Synchronicity also ties in with Carl Jung. But if it's not in line with our true purpose, maybe these ego collapses and this fracturing and this eruption of the shadow of all this stored content helps the self move in the direction that it's supposed to. That's what I found. And then also just the term psychotic process, not illness, not disease. It's a process that the self goes through. And that ties in with Carl Jung. One of his concepts, and I mentioned it in my book, is the process of individuation, where it's acknowledging both the conscious and unconscious and bringing that together to make the whole individual. That if you don't go through that process, you're only a part of the complete. So yeah. Oh, and to finish off, I actually got a kick out of it because I've been thinking about several of these metaphors and analogies for a few years now. Finally drafted a list and was thinking of putting them into a book, which I may still do. But a few years ago, it was the 150th anniversary of Yellowstone National Park. And I went down there, I can't remember, it was the end of April, early May, before tourist season and before the flood that wiped out the road that I mentioned in an earlier segment. But as I was strolling around Mammoth, I was in one of the gift stores, and I came across this card that it shows a few bison hanging out by Yellowstone National Park. And one of them says to the other, "Hey, you guys are awesome." And I laughed at that because because it was like, oh, apparently I geysered okay. And in a sense, I did. I came through it. You had to deal with the mess. The hard part was, as John Weir Perry mentioned, is that people who think they're helping often are not, because they have this, as he calls it, where was it, a stony resolve um, to suppress. That only creates more violence. And so finding ways to make room for this expansion and this explosion. And that's where things like out of Finland, I think it's about 20 years old, it's called Open Dialogue, has been very successful with helping people deal with these types of eruptions, if you want to call them that. 80%, up to an 80% success rate in working with people. Some do take drugs, many do not. I need to learn a little bit more about that. But there are other ways of working with these types of experiences. And one of my frustrations is that when I come across something that's 50 years old, John Weir Perry, Joseph Campbell, Stanislav Grof, a lot of this material has been out there for decades. And then it got wiped out by the DSM-3 in 1980 when the whole biomedical model took over, which that's where the focus became on, oh, these are illnesses. And that was just supposed to be a metaphor. But it, as I mentioned in the first segment, it wasn't a good one for me. So those are a few more of that type of metaphor and analogy. I hope you find it maybe interesting, or if you know somebody who's struggling, that watch for that kind of language. That I mentioned in another segment that several people will use the term ineffable to describe these types of experiences, which means words can't describe it, but people will try to describe it in many different ways. So thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And as always, if you like what I'm trying to do, please share with people you know who might be interested. Do all that stuff. But I hope to see you next time. But have a great day.